Welcome to Dynasty Builders, your go-to destination for fantasy basketball insights. Whether you're a seasoned veteran or just getting started, we've got something for you. Join us for engaging basketball banter, cutting-edge analysis, and next-level scouting that will give you the edge over your competition. Our takes are not just hot, they're backed by thought and evidence, offering valuable insights into both familiar and under-the-radar players. I'm Paul, the brains behind HoopDex, a visual fantasy basketball index that helps you assess players' strengths and weaknesses like never before. And with me is Zach, the mastermind behind Dizzled Dynasty Sports and our go-to guru for all things draft related. Together, we're here to take your fantasy game to new heights. Let's get started. The trade deadline is right around the corner as we're recording on Sunday, February 4th. By the time this podcast is released on hopefully Monday, Tuesday at the latest, we might be nearing the 24-hour countdown. So not a lot of huge top-end guys rumored to be on the move, as Josh pointed out. Shout out to Basketball Monster and the OGs. But we all know huge surprises can happen at the deadline and still plenty to talk about. We've divided players into three groups. Group 1, hot topic, clear top 100 fantasy names. Group 2, cheap contending assets whose value may be on the rise. And Group 3, cheap rebuilding assets to take a stab at. So, Zach, why don't you get us started? Dejounte Murray.
Yes, Dejounte Murray, one of the hotter names out there on the market right now. There's been a lot of rumors for him from teams like Philadelphia, the Lakers. We kind of know what he is as a player and an option. His off-ball shooting is the thing that really is what swings the fit best and what he can do. And, as we've talked about off mic, he's become a much improved off-ball shooter. I would say as far as his outlook and production wise, I think the best thing we can hope for is probably similar production to what he's shown in Atlanta. And especially in terms of the destinations, I'm not 100% sure, what works best or worst for his long-term outlook. But I think really what the best we can hope for is marginal decreases.
Yeah, it depends on the destination, but of the ones that are rumored, like you said, the Lakers in particular seems to be the hottest name. It might be a wash at best with AD and LeBron there. He does not get enough credit for his improvements in his shooting numbers, his shooting splits. So after arriving in Atlanta, he's noticeably improved his three-point shooting, as well as improving at the stripe. So that's something that's a little under discussed. But as fantasy players, we both know that, coming to Atlanta, sharing the ball with Trey, his rebounds and assist numbers have taken quite a fall. And I don't think that San Antonio Spur first round DeJounte is coming back.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Even though as much as I hope he would, I tend to agree with you. I don't think that's ever going to be coming back. Even if I know one team that I probably should have mentioned earlier that has been rumored is the Spurs potentially for a reunion. But as you said, it's kind of hard to really say whether or not that's really going to come back, if at all possible. So
Right. I'll throw this out to you. What if he goes to the Sixers and Embiid is shut down? What do you expect there?
see, that's a good question. I think especially now that we've seen the Zach Lavine surgery stuff, now that he's shut down for the year, I certainly think that DeJounte's probably more in play at this point. I think currently, I think the 76ers' best goal at this point is do what they can to win out. I mean, I'm not going to, I don't know for sure. But this is just my thought is they're going to do what they can to win out how they can with Tyrese Maxey leading the way. I think the general goal is just going to be see how far they can go and hope that they can get Joel Embiid back in time for, I guess, maybe the second round. I'm not sure exactly what the timeline looks like as far as his recovery, but I certainly think if they are trusting that Joel Embiid is going to be healthy at some point in the playoffs, I think the smart thing, especially with all of their expirings that they have, the things that they can move as far as assets currently, I think it would be a good thing for them to make the jump. Now, again, of course, that hinges on what they expect from the rest of the core and what they're able to give up for Dejounte Murray in terms of the asking price and what Atlanta's going to be looking for. But in general, I like the fit of Tyrese Maxey and Dejounte Murray. I think, like we talked about in terms of production and stats, in that context, just like you had said, it's going to be we're going to be looking at, about the current level of production, less than, might see obviously like some drops in like points long term. But I generally like the fit, and I think it's something that would be really good for the team. And so that would be my kind of thought is he would be really good rest of season if he ended up going to Philly. But long term, I definitely have my concerns.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. It's just something I thought of on the fly here. But if he did go to Philly, really there are very few offensive options right now. They were just throwing the ball to Embiid on the elbow and letting him shoot, you know, 20 mid-rangers and foul bait on half of them to get like half their points. Obviously hyperbole, but if he does go to Philly right now, he would shoulder quite a heavy offensive load. Down the road, yeah, his production would be similar in Atlanta, but in redraft leagues, if Dejounte ended up in Philly, I think that's a clear rise in value.
I think so too. I think that would definitely be the best opportunity. And I think definitely what I wonder now as we're discussing it about Philly, I don't know exactly where Tobias Harris fits into the equation there as far as, his expiring deal and what they plan to do. But, if your team for the time being, as you're starting to load towards the playoffs, if your team is going to be Maxey, DeJounte, and Tobias Harris as kind of like your lead options before Joel Embiid is healthy, I mean, that's pretty good. I think they would feel pretty good about that. I'm not sure if there's some sort of move to be made outside the margins or if there's something with Harris that they might end up doing. But, definitely down the road, you wonder about, how these things go and if they, it remains to be seen about Tobias Harris, but I think it will be interesting nonetheless to see them kind of fit that whole team together.
Yeah, for sure. You'd think they might try and get maybe an Andre Drummond or something to just bridge that center rotation. But regardless, they do have enough in Dejounte, Tobias, and Maxi, as you said, if they do get the deal done to use that core to get into the playoffs, especially in the East, right?
Definitely. I completely agree with you. And, to your question about, like an Andre Drummond type or something like that, I think of course it'll hinge on what they have left after a Dejounte deal. I would imagine it probably takes. I'm not sure offhand right now what they own as far as picks that they can trade just because of the Steepen rule.
Hmm.
They definitely have some assets. I think Jaden Springer is something that probably goes over there. I think, if they don't end up moving someone like Springer or some of their like other expirings with like Batum and Morris and stuff like that, they certainly have their options to, trade seconds and expirings perhaps for a center out there. But yeah, I think that would definitely be something I would look for is, adding like a DeJounte or something like that, and then adding a center perhaps to bolster because I don't know if they feel confident enough in Mo Bamba and Paul Reed. As good as they've had their moments, I don't think realistically it might be what they're looking for if the opportunity presents itself.
Yeah, for sure. As a basketball fan, obviously you hope Embiid can come back at some point this season. You hate to see stars, even though I don't like his play style. You hate to see stars just go down, and that's the thing that crumbles their season. It's always
Yeah.
terrible to see that happen. All right, let's move on to another name still in the Eastern Conference, Mikal Bridges. This is an interesting one. Zach, you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. It's definitely an interesting one. There's been a lot of heavy rumors that Brooklyn is turning down some pretty significant packages for him. Of course, it's all rumors. We don't know exactly what the offers are looking
You think
like and
that
what some
five
of the
first offer is real?
maybe before the CBA. I don't know. That's a very good question. I wondered that
Mhm.
myself if that is actually a legitimate offer, but it's pretty crazy. And I saw recently too that even Houston was looking to give up some of the picks they got in the Harden deal to potentially use on someone like Bridges, which shocked me to read for sure. But yeah, it's very interesting to see a lot of these big offers that are being rumored and them turning them down. From my view, and I think you would probably agree with me here, just kind of based on the things we talked about off mic. I think it's probably not going to happen for him ever being a realistic first option on a good team. I think that most teams that are probably coveting him in this deadline probably see him as like their third best guy, which I think is probably ideal if our reference point for the best version of him in terms of IRL play is going to be his Phoenix days. It gives me a lot of questions though. I don't really know exactly exactly what the opportunity is going to be for who's looking for him. I think definitely the Zach Lavine injury, as we discussed earlier, is going to change a lot of the interest in him, especially considering he has such a friendly contract for what he offers in his prime right now. Um,
I'm surprised that you said that most teams coveting him would see him as their third best guy instead of second. I do agree that third best guy is probably where he should be on the totem pole, but that seems like quite a drop from where he was end of last year, don't you think? That was that was a different guy. He really he was one of my biggest misses as a do not draft guy last year because I just didn't see. Well, first in Phoenix, I just thought he was kind of a boring fantasy player, honestly. When the stocks go, what really floats his value was his low turnovers. But then he got traded to Brooklyn and made me look like an idiot because they started running all of KD's sets for him and he was knocking down every shot. This year, he's obviously taken a bit of a step back. There's less of a need for him to take 18, 19 shots a game.
right.
And his turnovers have surprisingly gone up to 2.3 very quietly. That's a little under the radar decrease that people haven't noticed. But yeah, wow. From first to third option back to where he was in Phoenix, I wonder how he would feel about that.
That's kind of what I wonder, and I think maybe I was being a little facetious about their third best guy in a lot of teams. It does make me wonder though. I think, I don't know exactly what teams will be looking for out of him. I think first of all, I think definitely they're going to be hoping for the best version of him in his prime right now, which, like you said, he's been very good for sure, and he's definitely had the experience of being a first option in this regard. That maybe he's ready for a higher step, or maybe just kind of finding more of a balance with other players. I could certainly see him being a second best guy on a lot of teams. I do kind of wonder exactly what is out there for him in terms of the interest, though. I personally, early on in the season, maybe it's an unpopular opinion, or maybe people might disagree, but I was kind of wondering almost if someone like a Memphis would have been interested in Mikal Bridges, simply because he's someone that would fit really well with Jaren Jackson in the front court. I think he'd be a really good in betweener. If your backcourt is going to be John Morant and Desmond Bane, I think he offers a really good balance. And I think that's a stacked team for sure. I think that would be a really good team. And I don't know exactly what the aspiration is going to be at this point. A lot of the same teams are going to be looking for this type of guy, but it's like we said, it's hard to really trust exactly what is going to be out there for him, and realistically what it's going to take to acquire him in trades for what Brooklyn has been turning down at this point.
For sure, Zach. With what you said about McCall's overall skill set and over a larger sample size, what we've seen of him as a potential first option, do you still look at him as a surefire top 50 dynasty asset? As a lot of people, he was obviously put there by the majority of the community, but I mean it's got knocked down a peg. But do you still have him in the top 50 or no?
I think I've thought about this. I've really thought about this the last couple of weeks. He's on the cusp. I think he's somebody that I would view maybe just a hair outside the top 50. I think like late 50s, 60s is probably like an ideal spot for him. I think the caveat is that he's such an Iron Man, and knock on wood, of course, because I'm going to say that, and then something's going to end up happening. But he's always been such a steady player. I think we've kind of come to expect what we do about him. He's in his prime. He's 27. He's not very old, but he's definitely kind of reaching that point where you start to wonder exactly at what point, in what context, we're going to end up seeing things change for him after being a first option. And to your point, like you said, he's had the quiet rise in turnovers, which has been a little shocking. It's something I didn't really realize, I guess, until we started looking at this and kind of breaking down some of the numbers. And it's been pretty interesting, both with that and his true shooting that's kind of changed a little bit with, taking more shots and stuff like that. So I think overall, he's someone I'm a little bit outside on for a top 50. I think at this point, like I said, like late 50s, 60s is probably where I want him right now, and where I'm kind of viewing him as far as where he's going potentially with the trade. I think that's where I feel good about, is just outside the top 50. He's kind of, I don't view him as a surefire anymore, just like you said.
Gotcha. I think I would agree with you that I would have put him in that 50 to 65, 70 range. Like you said, he's 27. He's not as young as some people perceive him to be. He's already entered that prime age, so maybe like 5 years until the prime expires. My last question for you, this might be a little spicy. Would you rather have Mikal or Miles Bridges? So that clean image and Iron Man, but not that sexy fantasy game versus when he's on the court, a better fantasy game in Miles Bridges, but obviously all the strings attached with that.
Ooh, that is a really good question. And I think, too, especially with a lot of the Miles Bridges stuff heating up now, I've seen some rumors of him maybe having some interest from Phoenix. I've seen Detroit definitely has always been a name that's kind of kept in the mix there. It's hard to say. I think, as we sort of peel this back, like you said, the Iron Man aspect, and I think, he's a little boring. He's not quite like the high end, low end that Miles Bridges can tend to be in terms of some of the stats. I think generally speaking, I prefer Mikal. I think Miles Bridges is not terribly far behind in his version. He's a really great, like you said, he's got a great fantasy game, and he's someone who's been really good this year that not a lot of people have talked about for understandable reasons with the controversy and his image and stuff like that. But yeah, I think generally I prefer Mikal, but I don't think Miles is terribly far behind, and I think there's definitely an argument to be made.
Right. I would I would also be inclined to go with the safer option in Mikal. We don't know if Miles is going to be move into another situation and how he's going to look there, but I wouldn't fault anyone for taking Miles at this point. Let's move on to someone who we might have a little bit of a dissenting opinion on. It's a very polarizing name right now in the fantasy community, Jonathan Kuminga. So you actually threw this name to me, and I started researching this with a pretty high level of skepticism as someone who's been out on JK. He had a bad offseason, very poor showing at FIBA for Congo, low efficiency. He was making some really boneheaded plays. And in the past, he's had some attitude and laziness rumors. And the Warriors have been very non-committal towards his future. But after looking over his recent run, I gotta say, he's won me over. For some reason, I think I was looking through his game log and I saw that 11 for 11 game against Atlanta, maybe last month against Jalen Johnson. And I was thinking, if people are crowning Jalen Johnson already, why not Kuminga? Because
Right.
they have very, very similar career stats if you look at it. They're both pretty efficient scorers. Their games are more within the 3-point line at this point. Uh, they can be very good rebounders. Jalen Johnson's a better playmaker. Kuminga's a better athlete. But we've seen JJ do it for 30 games, and people are already putting him within the top 50, some even top 40. Kuminga's been a better fantasy player over the past month-ish, I want to say. It probably depends on if you're punting or anything. In a vacuum, I think Kuminga's probably very close to Jalen Johnson over the past month. So how long would JK have to maintain this level for people to also put him in the top 50?
Ooh, that's a very good question, actually, and it's something I've been trying to think about as well. I think as someone else who has also kind of never really been sold on Jonathan Kuminga as a whole, I think it's been undeniable, right? He's been really excellent this past month, and he's been doing a lot of things at a high level. And like you say, I mean, if Jalen Johnson is already starting to get there, why not Kuminga? I think, one of the things for me is really just continuing this level. I think, and as we'll talk about more of him down the road here in just a few minutes. I mean, he's easily been Golden State's second best player recently, very, very easily. And I think he's been the most consistent of the squad as of late. I think, one of the things that's made this rise so interesting for me is it's kind of come at a time where we've seen, the Draymond Green stuff happen. We've seen Klay Thompson, so off and on constantly. We've seen Steph look a little bit human at times. And Andrew Wiggins, I mean, he's
Andrew Wiggins falling off a cliff. Yeah.
horribly falling off a cliff. And it's he's kind of come at a point where, someone's needed to step up and he stepped up. And I think that says a lot about where he's going and where he's at right now. That gives me a lot more confidence. I think to your question, it's hard for me to say exactly how much more he needs to keep doing this to reach this level. I think I'd like to see more games of it ultimately. I would. I think I'd like to kind of see like where this thing goes and how far he keeps going, especially with the trade deadline coming up. And as I'll ask you, just because I'm a little curious, Do you think this Jonathan Kuminga explosion is a little more telling of whether they should be buyers or sellers at the deadline? And, the reason I ask is because, at this point, do you just see what you can offload as far as like Wiggins or Clay Thompson or whatever, just to kind of keep riding this thing out and see how far you can take Kuminga?
Wow. I think you would be hard pressed not to as the Warriors, considering they're definitely not going to just waste the rest of Steph Curry's prime. He obviously still has some gas in the tank. The same can't be said for Clay, and obviously Andrew Wiggins has completely disappeared. But yeah, I think if you are the Warriors, you have to look into, the potential of moving off Clay, completely committing to Kuminga as your second option and seeing how far that can take you because the alternative is just treading water. That team as currently constructed is, you know, really struggling and only fighting for a play-in lower seed in the Western Conference. I was gonna say I want to quickly correct myself. I believe Kuminga over the past month is still behind JJ in 9cat rankings. He's 57th versus 34th when I researched it. It might be a little the disparity might be a little bigger now that, factoring in last night's game. I think if I shorten the ranking span to maybe 3 weeks, Kuminga's jumps a little higher, and they would be very close there. I'd like to quickly talk about, do you think that top 50 price tag is warranted, and would you pay it personally? Because as much as Kuminga has won me over, it does feel risky. It feels like a buying high for sure. And I might pump the brakes a little bit. As someone who doesn't roster him, I would feel a little wary of paying that price tag.
I completely agree. I'm definitely, to be clear, I have really come around a lot on him recently, just in terms of everything. I mean, he's really come into his own as a player who just is really solid and just capitalizing on the high ceiling that we had hoped he would be originally, even though I was always a little bit skeptical, but he's really come into his own. And I think definitely he's able to reach the heights of a top 50 high end player as a second option as far as, where he can go from here. But I tend to agree with you. I wouldn't pay top 50 prices for him right now. I think, like you said, it's buying way too high for my liking. I think realistically, if I was to put him in a dynasty rank, right? And I'm not somebody who's ready to go like super overboard on Jalen Johnson. I've loved what Jalen Johnson has done, and I think he's been fantastic, especially as a playmaker. It's something I've always thought so highly of him. I think Jalen Johnson is somebody I'd probably have in that like 50s range right now. I think I feel okay putting Jonathan Kuminga up the 70s ish in Dynasty right now. So yeah, I think it would just be paying too much if he was able to go, if he was commanding a top 50 price. Just to throw some names out there, I would probably prefer him over guys like Tari Eason, Josh Giddey, Onyeka Okongwu, Walker Kessler, definitely DeAndre Ayton at this point. I think that's no question. Trey Murphy was one I kind of threw out there as far as a few offers for what Kuminga could warrant right now. I think I might take Kuminga over Trey Murphy.
Very interesting. Trey, I've always loved his game. Obviously, this season hasn't panned out the way you would hope, coming off that knee surgery. His game is more predicated on just elite efficiency, right? And that those threes and stocks. And I'm still high on Trey. Man, that would be a very tough decision for me. I think it's a wash, and I really can't decide on the spot right now. But I think if we're comparing Kuminga and Jalen Johnson for what their perceived cost is at the moment, I think Kuminga, because there's still so much controversy and people aren't buying into his recent run just completely yet, at cost, I think I would prefer paying like a top 80, 70 option to acquire Kuminga than paying a top 50 or 40 for JJ. I think there's more value there.
I think that's reasonable for sure. I think it's all about just whatever you can get cost wise. And I definitely agree. I think at this point, we've kind of, and timing is definitely a part of it, right? And perception. It's been one of these things where we've always kind of hoped that Jalen Johnson would kind of get to this point in terms of the hype and a lot of the fantasy interest of him, especially since Quinn Snyder took over from Atlanta, where he started to really prefer Jalen Johnson and use him a lot going into last year. So I think there's been kind of this budding interest in him that warrants the price tag. To your point, if there's a cost difference of that level where you can get Jonathan Kuminga as opposed to Jalen Johnson, just in terms of, those two types, I think that's definitely something I agree on. You got to take Kuminga at the cost. I think that just makes a lot of sense. And, you know, as we've documented, I mean, it's not far fetched for Kuminga to even get to that level, in terms of cost. So if that's possible, I totally agree with you. I think that's definitely the price that you pay if you have the option for either one.
Yeah, I would agree. And all it took for Kuminga was him throwing out a trade request for Shams. I don't know if it was a trade request or what that was, but it's definitely worked out for the young fella.
The trade request, and he got a haircut, and everything changed after that.
Oh yeah. He got clowned for that cut on Jeff Teague's podcast. They didn't like his haircut, but if it's working, man, it's working.
It's worked. It's definitely worked. I'll ask you one thing here real quick as we start to cycle off Jonathan Kuminga. I just kind of want to pick your brain about a couple guys, as we talked about in terms of price point and preference and stuff like that. So I just wanted to ask you, between these guys that I'm going to name, just let me know if you take them or you take Jonathan Kuminga at this point in Dynasty. So, first one, I'm not sure if we've had a conversation about this guy off mic. I honestly cannot recall, but would you take Jonathan Kuminga over Bilal Coulibaly right now?
I think I would be inclined to accept that offer to just ride the Kuminga wave, take that the more established asset at the moment, and Coulibaly, however you want to pronounce it, he has a sky high ceiling as well, but the offensive game is pretty unpolished at this point, and I don't have the confidence in Washington as a development system to really put him in the best position to succeed. So I think I would take Kuminga and his clearer path to becoming a second option on a good team. But it's close. But it's close.
Fair. I like that. And I'll tell you what, too, is, I've really come around and been pretty high on Coulibaly this
Mm-hmm.
year, even for the lack of polish and everything. I see such a high ceiling for him, and I love him very much. But I completely agree with you. I think I have to take Kaminga over him right now. I think there's so much of a difference in terms of polish, and especially, how they came into this league and what they started working on immediately and how they've progressed to this point. I mean, obviously, it's not the most fair comparison for what they're able to do just as a result of that. But yeah, I think I would definitely be inclined to take Kaminga. I completely agree with you. I think it's the right time, and I think it's the right price as well.
Yeah, it's ironic though that you said Kuminga has a lot more polish because we hadn't seen that polish until the last month, and sometimes players just it's just turning on a dime and you see that jump and it's undeniable.
Another name I want to ask you about here, Coby White. So one of the hottest names as far as a most improved player. He's been unbelievable this year for Chicago and really such a miracle for them in the wake of everything that's happened. With what you've seen out of Coby White, would you take Coby White over Jonathan Kuminga?
I think I think Kobe White is right in that top 70 to 90 range that we were saying as a potential price tag for Kuminga. And I think that's a reasonable price to pay. And personally, I think I would do it. I
Mm,
would trade Kobe White if I had him for Jonathan Kuminga, just based off, the potential fantasy skill set, like in their idealized states. We've seen Kobe take a huge step forward, but he's still not generating the defensive stats that we see
right.
the elite lead guards do in a fantasy sense. And the shooting can be on and off at times. Obviously, Kobe White is a very promising player with Zach Levine's shutdown. Rest of season value is very secure. But I think, yeah, like I said, in that top end scenario, Jonathan Kuminga's overall skill set probably leads into a higher ceiling that can be achieved.
Fair enough. I like that. You've sold me a little more on that. I think it would be a really close one for me. I've loved everything that Coby White has done this year, but I tend to agree that what Kaminga offers in terms of a profile and where he's going from here, I think just I think it makes sense. And I think Coby White is a fair price to pay. I think I wouldn't blame anybody particularly if they want to keep Coby White over Kaminga. But another name I want to ask you about here, Ausar Thompson. Obviously, we've seen a little bit of a dip since his hot start. He looked really great to start. Obviously, things have kind of changed with Detroit as far as spacing issues and just losing a lot, obviously. But just kind of like what we've seen for Thompson and where he has to go from here. Would you take Ausar over Kuminga?
Wow. It's funny because if you asked that at the start of the season when Sora was having that insane defensive run, people would have laughed you out of the building, especially with how heated people are about Kuminga. But 2 months later, that is I think a classic. Like, do you take the more proven asset or the seemingly extremely high upside? And I think it would depend on your team's core and like if you're a contender or a rebuilder. Whereas Coulibaly and Coby White, I think at this point I would take Jonathan Kuminga over them regardless of the team situation because Kuminga is still also very young.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I totally get that. I think that's very, very reasonable. I'll ask you one more name here, just one that I was starting to get a little bit into the weeds of him compared to the 2024 draft in such a weak draft, but I'm going to skip that for now. We can talk about that down the road as we see what Kaminga continues to do going in closer to the offseason. But the last thing I want to ask you about here is Shaedon Sharpe. Obviously, we've seen such a high ceiling for Sharpe. He's been very, very good as a
Mhm.
scorer, especially in Portland. I think much higher than everybody thought, just because he was such a mystery man coming out of high school and not playing for Kentucky at all. For where Shaedon Sharpe is at right now, would you take him over Kaminga?
I'm gonna sound like the biggest Kuminga homer after this podcast, but I would take Kuminga over Shaedon Sharpe at this point. The last run has been so impressive. I think especially when players have these runs when they're needed, when they're tasked to really show up, it's more there's more of a weight and more of a gravitas to it than, the early March until the end of the year run. When you're doing this in January and February when your team is struggling and your veterans are hurt or, players aren't playing up to par and they really need a spark, versus, Shaedon's run at the end of last year was obviously very impressive and skyrocketed his stock in the fantasy community. But what JK is doing now to me is a more indicative of a a safer floor value because
Mhm.
he's shown that he can do all this stuff when the games really matter. And Shaedon, so far this year, I know he's going through some injury woes, and he's obviously is he 20 or 21?
He actually, I don't think he turned 21 until I want to say like May or June. So he's still very, very young.
Right. Yeah, he's also I would say his ceiling is as high offensively as Asar's is defensively. So that is a very, very good player. And
Mm.
if you just watch his highlight tape, like, wow, he can jump out of the gym. But all that being said, like I said, JK's performance right now really, to me, has cemented his value in the top 75. And I think I have Shaedon just a hair below that.
Fair. Okay. I gotcha. I think for me right now, I think I would prefer Shaedon Sharpe, but I think it's definitely close to your point, and I completely agree that perhaps at this point, just with it what Kaminga is able to do in terms of his profile, I think is absolutely fair for him to be considered over Shaedon Sharpe. I think for me right now, I probably have Shaedon just like you. I think I have him a hair above Kaminga at the moment. I'd have to really do some soul searching on that because I think that's the one where I'm like probably the closest, I would say. But yeah, it's getting really to that point. I mean, Kaminga's been very impressive. I mean, it's pretty amazing. We have so many really great players who are in contention for being most improved this year, and the fact that he is around so strongly in the wake of so many great players, like we had named Jalen Johnson, Coby White, so many great names, but it's like, good lord, this dude has just been like on fire recently. Especially this late in the game. It's unbelievable.
It truly is. It's quite eye-opening. And it's really fun seeing the fantasy community try and wrap their heads around it, and we will see how it goes rest of the year. All right. So the next name on the list we have Nick Claxton. Big breakout last year. Sort of rumored to be on the trade market, available via Brooklyn. What do you think about Nick?
I love Nick Claxton, I do. And this is probably someone that I think my pathos kind of overrides a little bit of the honest thought. I think he's really fantastic. I think he's one of the best rim protectors in the league. He had a really legit case for Defensive Player of the Year and definitely all defense last year. I think he's also just had one of the coolest player development leaps of the last few years that I've seen. He's really gone from, being so young and inexperienced as a rim protector and not and having like so many flaws to his offensive game to just being this really flashy, versatile, great rebounder. He's evolved in like every which way, and it's been really incredible to see. And I think, even for some of the cons of his game without like the jump shot, he's got the poor free throws that are exploitable. It makes you wonder how far he can go without the shot. And I think he kind of goes through a similar effect that someone like Rudy Gobert goes through, where sometimes the defensive stats can kind of like wax and wane a little bit just because he's such a good rim deterrent. So I think it kind of makes it easier for teams to kind of game plan around him and him kind of like missing out on some of those with the volatility of it. But he's really excellent. I think this is the type of guy that a lot of teams should be watching out for. For me, I want to see him for his fantasy and dynasty value. I want to see him stay in Brooklyn. I think that's probably the best thing for him in terms of the long-term value. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. It shocked me to see that he was being made more available than my original perception.
Yeah, the jump that he took last year was, I think it really was one of the unforeseen leaps that no one really saw coming. We all knew that the opportunity of being a starting five was there in Brooklyn, but no one could have seen him, more than double his steals and blocks in only 10 more minutes per game. So his blocks went from 1.1 to 2.5, and he averaged nearly a whole steal after averaging just 0.5 the year before that. And he did that with his minutes going from 21 minutes to less than 30 still, 29.9. So that jump was crazy. I picked him in a startup dynasty last year, and I dealt him before the season started, and a lot of sleepless nights. But like you said, Rudy Gobert effect, I think it's very real. It's a little under discussed. When shot blockers, you know, when they get to a certain level, their block numbers can actually decrease because they are so good at blocking the ball. So teams will start to game plan around you as a rim deterrent, and they're less inclined to challenge you, and that results in a drop in the blocks production. Like you said, though, I think for Claxton, for his fantasy value's sake, the best thing is probably staying in Brooklyn. It's obviously a system that suits him. When they play a little smaller, he's a great perimeter big who can stick onto quicker guards and still recover. The thing is, like you said, you're surprised he's available. For me, I think part of that is maybe because of their lack of success this year. They've really struggled to stay in the play-in picture. Even they've really taken quite a tumble down the standings, and perhaps they want to see what they have in Sharpe, who's also a very young, promising center, obviously of a very different mold. But Daron's also improved tremendously. Fantastic rebounder. He has more potential as a floor spacer than Claxton. Like he obviously won't take more than zero point 0.5 a game at this point. But I've read the Athletic articles about how he's hired shooting coaches and he wants to stretch his range out. Obviously, in the ideal case for the Nets, they prefer having both centers. Clax for the perimeter defense and small ball lineups, and Daron for to handle the bruisers. But financially, that might not be viable for other players they want to bring in. Well, what do you think? Do you think if you prefer the Nets stick with Claxton as their starting center, what do you think of Daron's value as a dynasty player?
I think that at this point, regardless of whether Claxton stays or goes, I think Sharpe should be in a pretty good spot for his dynasty value. I think, of course, if Claxton stays at this point, Sharpe is probably never going to get his opportunity to, be a starter unless he's traded or something like that. I think at this point, I like their balance. To what you said, I think I definitely could see a situation where they decide, hey, Sharpe is maybe like who we see maybe fitting more. I'm not sure, and that's what kind of interests me, right? Is Claxton is going to be a unrestricted free agent in 2024. I think he's going to command a really good price tag. My guess is probably something around like Jarrett Allen's contract, maybe like
Mhm.
20-ish million dollars a year. But then it kind of leads me to the question of like, what then happens with Cam Johnson? What happens with Mikal Bridges, right? And when you kind of break down these money things where it's like, okay, if they're not going to trade Mikal Bridges or they're not going to trade Cam Johnson or whatever, maybe Claxton is more available. Maybe it ends up getting to the point where, you see Day'Ron Sharpe and you want to see what he's able to offer, with this floor spacing that maybe would end up working out better for them if they just fully commit to that for the year or just see what happens down the road, right? Because they have they're going to have their picks coming up over the years. So I don't know. I think Sharpe is going to be pretty. I think he's going to be pretty secure, but it's a hard question for sure. Do you think he feels pretty secure at the moment, or do you think it's really just going to take a move for Claxton?
Right. Yeah, it is a tricky one to really figure out because, Jack Vaughn does have a lot of young talent on his hands, and the lineups are very. I think a lot of the players on the Nets, they have very rigid skill sets, but they're very good at them. Obviously, Claxton is a very good rim protector. He can stick with guards on the perimeter, but there are very glaring holes as well. He can't really handle the bruiser type, and obviously his free throw shooting and lack of shooting is an issue. And then for the guards on the Nets, Cam Thomas is a bucket, but he can't really do anything else. And so just like figuring out how to maximize that lineup hasn't really gone the way I think Brooklyn has hoped it would. And it would really depend on what kind of offers they get for Claxton. And if they really get something, that they can't refuse, then I do see the possibility of them turning the reins to Sharpe because he's on a cheap contract under team control through 24-25, has shown enough, I would say, to, throw him the starting job and see what you have there. Because at the moment, if they don't believe they have the right group of players to be more than a team competing for the play-in in the East, then, there's no point. Try blowing it up. Try trading Mikal for 5 firsts and trading Claxton for another young guy and rebuilding from there. I say all this with the caveat that the majority of the time teams will play it safe, and if you have a middling roster, they will generally still stay together. But I do see a scenario where Sharpe is given the keys to the starting job.
I think so too. I think there's, just like you said, I mean, like if you're gonna get the things to fix your roster and you're gonna get these things where you can kind of like blow bits up and you can, figure out from there how to piece this together better. I think you just got to do it sometimes. And that's one of the things that's so fascinating to me about Brooklyn right now is, these turn down offers or rumored turn down offers for, high prices for Mikal Bridges making Claxton more available than originally perceived. It's all of these kind of it's a domino effect is what it feels like to me. You have these pieces like Dorian Finney-Smith, you have Royce O'Neal, who they just traded for recently, obviously with different context. But you have all these pieces and these pieces that they want, first for. I've seen, people still talk about the Dorian Finney-Smith. I had seen something just kind of briefly that they had like are allegedly turned down like 2 first-round picks, which I don't really know if I buy. But it's just kind of to my point where it's like, they have all of these pieces. I don't know what it takes for the first domino to fall and them to decide like, okay, this is like the direction that we want to go. I think it's like it's hard for me to kind of see like what has to happen for these other things to happen. I think ideally what to me at this point, I think it's like, okay, if you're going to trade either Cam Johnson or you're going to trade Mikal Bridges, therefore, I would think the thought process is you want to keep Nick Claxton and then you can pay him now because you have the open availability. But then it's like, okay, if you trade Nick Claxton, then you're able to keep some of these other pieces and then you're able to figure it out. It's just like, I don't know. I feel like I have more questions than like definitive thoughts on the direction of Brooklyn.
Yeah, I think it's totally a cloud to me. I can't read it, especially with all these reports that all these guys are available. It's a tough one to sort out, and it's something that, we will have to see in a couple days.
For sure.
Let's move on to the last name in Group 1, the clear top 100 fantasy guys, Zach Lavine. So, as of recording, the news has already broke that He's going to be out for the year, undergoing a foot procedure to fix something in his sore right foot. Do you think that signals that he's staying in Chicago now, Zach? Because it's probably pretty hard to trade him at this point.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty tough at this point. I think, it seems like a lot of the interest, and again, it's all these rumors that we hear. It's hard to really like discern like what's actually true and what isn't oftentimes. But I think definitely at this point, with Zach Levine's massive albatross of a contract, I think it's already been tough to move him and to garner a lot of interest. I think it's just even harder now with the foot things, especially because we know these foot little ticky tack things has been a theme in recent years. And I'm not going to say he's like an injury prone guy. I don't want to give him that label at this current time, but I think it's definitely a concerning trend of things. I think at this point, the best thing for them is, they're probably going to have to keep Lavine. I don't think there's really most other ways to go about it unless there's like something random that comes up. And I think really, they may end up just having to get to the point where they trade Vucevic and they trade DeRozan and they tear down what they have and they just kind of figure it out with the Zach Levine thing as it goes. I mean, this is just kind of me going a little off the cuff, but it's hard to see. It's hard to kind of build like a really good roadmap for what the answer is. I think to me, the best thing is to, if there's any sort of opportunity to break Zach Levine down and get something of value to which like you can actually trade for like more value. Like for example, like let's say he got traded to Detroit, right? And they got Bojan Bogdanovic, they got like Joe Harris. I don't know, maybe like a couple seconds, whatever. If there's any sort of opportunity where you can do that and you can flip Bojan directly and you can get what you can for that in terms of just being like a cheaper asset, I think that's kind of the opportunity, right? I think like whatever you're able to do with that is what you're able to do. But I guess until then, you kind of just have to like weather the storm.
I think, yeah, I do think Chicago's been put in a pretty tough spot, as they honestly have been for the past 2 or 3 years. I promised you a very spicy take on Zach, and I'll say it now. DeMar DeRozan was the worst thing that could have happened to Zach Levine.
Whoa. Huh.
That, Zach, do you know what Zach Levine averaged in 2020, the year before DeRozan arrived in Chicago?
Um,
Off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, I feel like I would be inclined to think it's like an over like 22 points per game.
So in 2020, 2021, on a roster that was Zach Levine, Lauri Markkanen, might have been rookie sophomore Coby White, and literally nobody else, Zach Levine averaged 27.4 points on 50.7% shooting, 41.9% from three. Those are
What?
legitimately absurd numbers. Like I had him that year in fantasy, and it was magical. And people have forgotten about it, but a shooting guard on his shot diet, averaging almost 28 points with no other offensive player that can draw attention, and to shoot 50% from the field on 8.2 attempts from three, that season should be something that should be studied because Zach Levine was a monster, man. And DeMar came over the next year, and Chicago literally, I remember watching this the first month of the year. There were a couple close games down the stretch, and they were trying to gel. And Zach deferred because DeMar is obviously the veteran, the newcomer, and he wanted to make things transition smoothly. So DeMar hit one game winner, and then he hit another, and then that was it. That was wraps. DeMar was the 1A, Zach was the 1B. And ever since then, Zach's stats have taken a little bit of a dip. I wouldn't say it's not even a slide, but he's still been a very efficient player for his shot profile. And I really believe that if DeMar never arrived in Chicago, or if Chicago empowered Lavine to be the clear 1A star and have DeMar supporting him, we'd be looking at a very different picture right now in terms of perceived value and how people are looking at his career, because this is a player that I saw something really early on in Minnesota, and I didn't want them to trade Lavine in that Butler deal. I would have rather them trade Andrew Wiggins, and they elected to keep Wiggins over Lavine to acquire Butler. So Lavine is someone I've always had an affinity to. I might be biased, but yeah, that is my take. DeMar DeRozan is the worst thing that could have happened to Zach Levine.
Wow. I like this take now. I was a little unsure exactly like what direction we were gonna go here, but wow, I like this.
Yeah. I never seen it discussed anywhere. I just had to get it out there. Obviously, I'm crushed. Zach had to go through that season-ending surgery right now. His future in Chicago is kind of in limbo, but yeah, getting that out there. What do you think?
I'm curious. Well, I'll ask you too, just because like it's something that I was kind of thinking. Um, at this point, his future, like you said, it's pretty in limbo with Chicago. It's hard to really predict exactly like what the move is from here.
Mhm.
When you consider everything with the contract, with the direction of the Bulls. I mean, there's a lot of questions I have as far as that goes. With a trade coming, whether that's, coming up soon or it's still a ways away, what do you think about what Zach Levine's future looks like on another team? Like, do you have any sort of like opinions or ideas as far as like where you think he would fit really well for dynasty value?
Mm. I think for managers who believe in Levine or are in soft rebuilding, trying to gear up for next season, it's a wise time to look into acquiring Levine in Dynasty. I think this is a player that still has a lot of potential to be a perennial top 50 player. He's 28. Obviously, his game relies a bit on the athleticism, but since that knee injury that cost him the very beginning of last season. Last offseason, he had a small knee procedure, and then it seemed quite ominous, honestly. People were saying that, he missed the first game, and people were projecting that he was going to miss a lot of time. It was going to be an ongoing issue. He would rest all back-to-backs. And then he went ahead and played 77 games on it and played pretty much every back-to-back. So that was kind of perplexing. And then this season it was the opposite. Seemingly no health concerns. He comes in and now he has to have a season-ending surgery. I would hope that they're not correlated, and I would hope that the foot surgery was something he elected to do because it would help him not have to go to Detroit. We've seen the memes. Zach, you're going to Detroit. Oh, actually, I need to have foot surgery. But I would say if he comes back healthy, I think there's still a top 50 player in Zach. If he went to a situation where he's motivated and there's meaningful basketball to be played, I think you would see a reinvigorated side of him on the defensive end as well. People always knock him for not putting in the proper effort on that end of the ball. But I think it is kind of hard to put 100% when your team, 3-4 years has been middle Eastern Conference. You're relegated to you kind of had your team stolen from under you, and you have to play it cool on the surface every night. So yeah, if he went to a team where they're playing very meaningful basketball and he is being looked at as a key offensive cog, then we could see his reputation turn around in a big way, in my opinion. You asked me what destinations would be best for him. I think the dream destination in a real life perspective, maybe not fantasy, would be Dallas, playing off ball to Luca. I think that would be pretty unstoppable. That would be an unstoppable offense if he could somehow make his way to Dallas. In a fantasy sense, what destination would be best for him? It would have to be somewhere where he's rethrust into that 1A role. And truthfully, it is a little hard to see what team would give him that opportunity coming off a season-ending surgery. So that's a hard one. But yeah, Zach Levine is someone who, if gettable, if you can get Zach Levine right now for someone in the top 100 range, which I think is possible in certain leagues, I would be inclined to take that plunge.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think now is definitely the perfect time to buy. If I think I can certainly understand some people being out on him in certain regards, but I think generally this is absolutely the time that you want to buy. All right, guys, that about wraps things up. To quickly recap today's show, Dejounte is probably a wash in terms of fantasy value if he goes on the move. Nets star Bridges and Claxton are difficult to project given the Nets' uncertain direction. Jonathan Kuminga's ascent feels pretty legit, and Zach Levine, well, y'all should probably go and hear Paul's take on him if you missed it. It definitely caught me pretty off guard. If you enjoyed our show, please leave a 5-star review. Your support means the world to us starting out here, and we really hope you come and join us soon. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Dizzle Dynasty, Dizzle Dynasty, and Paul over at Hoopdex. And we'll be back very soon for a post trade deadline pod. So keep your eyes peeled for that.